Earlier this year, the state was moving toward new efforts to bridge the achievement gap in public schools. Instead, school closings prompted by the coronavirus pandemic have resulted in new challenges and increasing division that could leave many local students farther behind. That was a concern for the town hall recently held by the Boston Education Justice Alliance. To tell us about the needs expressed by parents and educators is the group's director, Ruby Reyes. Thank you very much for being with us, Ruby.
Thank you.
Right, what about what people were telling you in the town hall, especially about their struggles with the distance learning in Boston?
Well, we had two town halls. Representative John Santiago, who's also a doctor in the ER at Boston Medical Center, joined us and was able to answer questions about the nexus of policy, as well as just things going on at Boston Medical Center, and just able to answer questions, medical questions about the disease itself with families. And then, the rest was discussion based. Families talked a lot about their concerns, and there's a broad range of them. Some parents, I think overall there's a lot of just frustration and concern around social emotional issues, around academics. Recently with the distance learning work that's happening, the Boston Public Schools are moving into this phase 2 of attendance and specific times that young people are supposed to be on their Chromebooks and doing academic work, and folks had a variety of different concerns for English language learners. A lot of parents the materials come to them in English, and there's a kind of an expectation that parents are going to help their children. They have to help their children, at least to log into the computer and then support their work. And it's really difficult when everything is in English if they don't speak English. And the same thing, I think, with special education. We had, parents and grandparents who talked about, their children being super active and not being able to sit in front of a computer for 5 minutes, or getting frustrated with the lesson. And I think, it's a very hard time for families. It's a very hard time to expect, there's a lot of expectation for parents around, them, if they're working from home or if they're having to go to work as essential workers, but also having to parent, and then also having to do homeschooling, and then also having to do tech support. So it's just, there's a lot. There's also a lot of families that are in the midst of grieving with loss, families that are dealing with members of their family that are quarantined, finding space for them, supporting them. So there's just so much going on with families that they talked a lot about a variety of different things, but those were some of the main things that kind of bubbled. We did have a mom who talked about, there was an email sent out to her about, attendance and participation in the online classes being important to be promoted to the next grade level. And she was confused, and I reassured her that, her child's going to be promoted to the next grade level, as has been indicated by the district. But just the way that the emails were worded made it seem like it was required, and, it was very important for the participation, which it is. But at the same time, I think there could be more direct language to reassure families about, that there's some days, that their kids just can't sit in front of the computer anymore, or young people they're on different levels in terms of waking up at different times, and with younger children, they're super active, they have a lot of energy. It's hard. I think families are afraid to go outside, given how congested Boston is. And so really being able to get your child outside to even use up some of that energy is hard. So they're inside all day. And, if your child wakes up late, sometimes those that hour in the morning is just silence, and coffee by yourself is just, one of the gifts of the day. So, I think the range of needs is huge. The range of concerns is huge. But overall, I think folks are just really struggling and in a difficult place.
You mentioned social and emotional angle with the children. Usually we would think of that in connection with things happening outside the home, the stress of being with other kinds of kids or being exposed to bullying. But when kids are home under these circumstances, what else is going on that makes this more of a challenge?
Well, I mean, some families, there's different ages of siblings. Siblings don't always get along. I think the social part of, being able to go to school and like see your best friend, those things are missing. Seeing your classmates. There's also just, like parents are with their children for so much more concentrated time that it is frustrating. Sometimes you just kind of like get away from me for a little while, which is, very valid. And so, there's kind of those basic things. And then there's like the broader, that you're kind of quarantined with people that maybe you enjoy being with and maybe you don't. And so I think that is what is contributing to like spikes in violence. And then on top of that, there are families that are grieving. And when people grieve, they have a mix of emotions. And that also, can erupt in violence, can erupt in these different types of manifestations of behavior. I myself am an introvert, so I've been doing okay with the social distancing, but, for people that are extroverts, especially children that maybe want, a lot of, or accustomed to a lot of attention, maybe not through their teacher, but their school communities, right? That's missing, and that's really hard. So you have this kind of broad range of kids in their different levels of development, and it's just it's that's like basic stuff, and then you get into the frustrations of, on top of that, having to have your mom also work, plus manage opening this Chromebook, and stuff is not in English, and how do I support my child to like even understand what they're supposed to be doing for the day. Or the young person gets frustrated with the Chromebook because it's acting up, or it goes really slow. So there's it's just so much, and the range is really huge.
I know all students have to contend with their parents' limitations and how to adapt to some new feature on a computer or the internet. But what about language learners? If they have to do all their learning remotely, how much does that set them back?
I think we're going to see a huge amount of setback. I think there's a lot of individualized work that's going to be required in the future, which, with the Boston Public Schools, we've had chronic budget cuts over the past, 20 years. That, the individualized work is just really, really going to need to be ramped up. And I don't know that there's necessarily funds for those things, but I think that gap is going to be huge. The folks that are being left behind are our English language learners and our special ed students. Our English language learners, the language components of learning things via computer is very different than even, practicing conversations, or, I think a lot of times with English language learners, they go to school and they're surrounded by, English speakers. And so they're able to pick up a lot. But then when you're at home, if the household only speaks Spanish or Arabic, they're kind of going back to an environment where they have a different language. And so that, I think that gap is going to be even bigger, just by virtue of being around in an environment with mostly English speaking. You're picking up things, which is why it's easier for young people to kind of absorb a new language. And so with that not happening, I think it's definitely going to be even harder when students do go back.
And there is this real difference between the daily flow of conversation in English, and then you come home and you got to read it all on the computer, and you're taking the time to figure it out. I mean, that slows things down, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the easiest way to learn a language is to be immersed in it and be forced to use it. And so with that not being a factor, right? Like you're spending maybe 30 minutes doing a lesson in English versus being at school for 6 to 8 hours and being surrounded by it, and somebody, your teacher or your friend explaining, oh, okay, well, leche is milk, and just even by virtue of being able to pick up those small things, I think it's going to have a huge impact.
I want to ask you about one development that was in the works just as the schools were being closed down. And only a few months ago, we thought the state was going to put a lot more money into bridging the achievement gap in all these communities throughout the state. And there was an agreement between the state and Boston to do something for a lot of the underperforming schools. In one hand, it seemed to be a positive step, but you were also concerned about the way this was put together.
Well, we did a lot of work around the Student Opportunity Act. We were so excited that it was signed in November 2019 by Governor Baker. We were super excited to see funds finally being put into public education across the state, not just in Boston, but specifically for communities that had high levels of low-income students and English language learners and special ed students like Boston. And so for us, our advocacy work is now to really push the legislation to really be committed to public education as they were before, but financially, right? And so Baker this year in his budget reduced or put the number of the percentage of low income funds at 4%, which didn't do a lot of, we didn't see the influx of funds that we needed for low income students, especially in communities that are low income, and especially in communities that have been under receivership, that have been under partial receivership. So communities like Springfield, which has an empowerment zone, which is a version of receivership. Lawrence Public Schools, Holyoke. And so Boston, for the past couple of years, has been compared consistently to Lawrence. And so our expectation was that the state was going to try and put Boston under receivership. However, the state has also never put a school district as large and complicated as Boston under full receivership. So we didn't expect that it would go under full receivership, but there would be some form of attempt. And so this MOU that was signed, this Memorandum of Understanding, was signed on March 10th. The school closures were announced on March 13th. So 3 days later, we kind of went into this crisis mode. And I think that the MOU, what makes it so dangerous is that it's very vague. So there's a caveat in it that says that the state can, if the state feels like the goals are not being met, they can terminate the agreement within 30 days given written notice. So that's the first place where there's the potential for receivership in a very real way. The second is that the details of the goals and the expectations would be worked out within the next 60 days. So this agreement was signed without actual goals and expectations being agreed to, right? So it's an agreement without actual detailed agreement. And so that is also very dangerous. And so those 60 days, we have no idea when they start. We have no idea if they're going to start. And so we do know that on May 18th, the agreement will go into effect, right? So we don't know if on May 18th, those are, our clock starts ticking. And the reality is that, if the state decides that after 30 days, Boston has not met these goals that haven't been, hashed out, they can go into a full receivership. And I think a lot of the things that were written in the MOU were, for example, the transformation schools or the lowest performing schools, that the MCAS would be used as an indicator of, you know, them doing better progress. And we know that that's not a good indicator of progress. It's an indicator of just the number of young people that pass the MCAS. It doesn't measure progress at all. And so for us, you know, there is an expectation that we will not be able to meet an increase in graduation rates, an increase in young people passing the MCAS, most especially with the academic loss that's happening right now, not just for English language learners and special ed students, but across the board. And so I do think that, you know, it's kind of fallen off the radar for folks, but the reality is that these things happen when there is time of crisis. It happened in New Orleans, which is now 100% charter. It happened after Hurricane Katrina. It happened in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, with the closure of over 300 public schools. And now it's happening here in Boston, where, you know, there's a crisis of some sort and some vague agreement is put into place. And so it is very dangerous.